Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Talk Conversation Series, a peer knowledge resource by the CXOs for the CXOs. Now to our host, Kanika Goswami.
Hi, we welcome you to a podcast on stage with enterprise thought leaders. My name is Kanika Goswami and I'm the managing editor of IT Security Wire, which is an enterprise security publication. We have engaging conversations with global thought leaders and industry experts on a very regular basis, and they reach about 1.3 million business leaders worldwide. In 2024, there was one deepfake attack attempt every 5 minutes. Deepfake are now being used to target both businesses and individuals, with targets ranging from identity fraud to the viral spread of misinformation to bypassing biometric authentication and beyond. It is becoming an epidemic of sorts. Today we have with us Richard Ford, the Chief Technology Officer at Integrity360, to discuss the rise of deepfake and how you can best defend yourself. Welcome to the show, Richard. It's great to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here and to make my debut on the pod.
Right. So I'll just give a short introduction to Richard. You've previously held the role of Technical Director for Integrity360. He brings over 15 years of experience of the IT sector, with the majority of his career spent directly in the IT security channel. Richard brings a vast amount of knowledge, skills, and experience to the company and its customers, and has been integral to the success of the managed security services that includes SIEM, SOAR, EDR, and MDR. Anything you'd like to add, Richard, which I may have missed?
Yeah, I think the team, I think it's nearly 20 years actually in industry, so I think the team haven't updated that in a while. I think the only other thing I can add is that I've recently taken up cricket as a sport, and that's I think everything else covers it.
Right. So my first question to you is, Richard, that CISOs have accepted the fact that cyber attacks occur constantly, every day, all the time. How do they keep the basic defenses up? They cannot escape it. They cannot be eliminated. So what do you suggest they should do?
Yeah, it is really challenging. And actually the retail attacks, successful retail attacks in the UK from Easter, and I think M&S being one of those, has only just got their website back up online, has really highlighted the challenge that organizations face, and actually that the basics are extremely important. And actually AI will will play into that in a significant way. But one of the things that organizations are not great at is doing the cybersecurity basics. It's cyber hygiene. We did a survey, or actually we crunched the numbers on the data that we hold to really produce a report on what do we see, and particularly when we look at vulnerabilities, which is the source of a lot of breaches, a lot of attacks. And organizations, we're seeing that still taking on average 97 days to patch a critical vulnerability. Now, this could obviously be for a significant amount of reasons. It may be on systems that are extremely difficult to patch, but it's still leaving organizations open and vulnerable. I think just interestingly, high vulnerabilities was 91 days. So I don't know what the 6-day difference between the two. But the other important thing from that perspective that we saw when we were looking, rather than at vulnerabilities, but exploit attempts, nearly a third of the exploit attempts that we observed and recorded related to vulnerabilities from the last decade. And obviously attackers are not going to waste their time trying to exploit old vulnerabilities if they're not getting continued success. So that really highlights that actually lots of organizations, lots of systems out there on the internet and accessible are still unpatched and still being breached overall. And we've got a rather excellent incident response team that are extremely busy with helping customers with incidents. Most of those do have an initial attack vector of exploiting a vulnerability, and still over 3 years on now, they're seeing instances of where it's related to Log4Shell and being breached. And it just shows that even something as public as that vulnerability is still being struggled to be patched. Now we could call out there's a couple of reasons why there. Probably some of it is related to vendors not understanding it's even in their stack because they don't have the the software bill of materials. But in the majority of the instances that we've looked at, it's just not understanding that it's there from a understanding your attack surface and looking to patch those. So that's, I guess, one area of the basics from a technology perspective, but from a vulnerability. But if we look at the CIS top 18 as it is now, there obviously used to be the SANS top 20 if you go far enough back. A lot of the things are still not being done. So understanding where your assets are, understanding your software inventory, what software's where, and actually, if you look at some of those, retail breaches, you look at some of those very top of mind threat actor groups like Scattered Spider. One of their attack techniques, once they've breached the perimeter and they're laterally moving and they want to sustain, create persistence, they're using remote management tools that are very legitimate, which makes it obviously harder to be able to detect them because they're legitimate platforms, but they're still foreign to many organizations' environments. So, not understanding the inventory of software makes it very difficult to be able to spot, when there's malicious software. And we could talk about secure configuration. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of the basics is really around our people and being able to secure them. I think, not that we should be calling our people the weakest link, but they are one of those. I can actually say third parties as well is probably one of those weak links. But I won't jump into that now. But when we think about our people, most of them are they're the biggest target. That they, through social engineering and otherwise. I think I'm just thinking to some the Verizon data breach report from last year and the Isaac Journal both called it out as being 68% and 67% of breaches are have a element of non-malicious human activity, and the majority of that is going to be falling for phishing attempts. Providing reuse of credentials. So that's one of the basics that is not being addressed enough. But I will say on the user side, extremely difficult to address. I think Gartner did a study a couple of years ago now on secure user behaviors or potentially not. And I might get my percentages ever so slightly wrong here, but 65% of users will quite happily open an email attachment from an unknown sender. Similar kind of number around reuse of passwords. And then, and similar again around sending unencrypted sensitive information. But the most important stat that they had was that 97% of those users admitted that even though they know it increases or introduces enterprise risk, they're going to do it anyway. So there's a whole challenge there around our people. How do we move them more towards secure culture and security behaviors that we need to address? And I think that brings us very nicely on to deepfakes, really, because it's just going to be the next step up from that. Because deepfakes, yes, as you kind of mentioned, can be used to target biometric authentication. The primary use of that is going to be social engineering, which really we kind of see that as social engineering 2.0.
So I just want to take a step back and ask a question which may not be very politically correct. That there is so much information floating around. There is so much literature. There are so many policies. There are so many strategies, so many tools. Why is it that even today, at this day and age, people are still, humans are still one of the weakest links, if I can't say the weakest link, and companies are not so well prepared? Do you think there's enough out there to keep them on their toes?
Yeah, well, do you know what? When we look at deepfake defense, and actually we look at those behaviors, what's the answer to those? Is it more and more security awareness training? The problem is we've kind of probably reached the pinnacle, the peak of where that can be effective. And people just, particularly if it's repetitive, not challenging, there's no gamification of it, then people are going to become and grow to be numb to it. And I think that's, from a people perspective, that is going to be one of the main reasons that we've got all these tools out there. If we talk from a technology perspective in terms of security, and we go back to what we're talking about in terms of the basics, then I'd say that probably having all those exciting new tools that particularly technologists like myself and that love a new shiny tool, there's a tendency to then potentially ignore the ones that you've got, not getting the very best out of those platforms, and those platforms are delivering some of those core security capabilities. So there's loads of tools, but we do need to think about actually how we're using those and how we're approaching that kind of user training, because just bashing users over and over again. I've heard one person say, actually, we hold people to account, and it's almost like a public embarrassment and grilling. That's definitely not the way to do it, because if you think about defending against a breach and actually identifying a breach, and particularly social engineering, your humans and your people in your business, we might think about them as the weakest link, but they're our first line of defense, and our first, they're our canaries that should give us that early warning sign of, I've just clicked on something that I probably shouldn't have. Now, if you're going to hold people up and embarrass them, well, surprise, surprise, people aren't going to offer up that information, which is going to make it even worse in the long term.
Right. That's a very human perspective there, right there. So that brings us to deepfakes. Now, what should organizations be prepared for if faced with a deepfake attack, intrusion, whatever you might want to call it?
Yeah. So, as I said, what I see is the primary use of deepfakes is obviously going to be impersonating people, and twofold. One is social engineering. And you can look at that, the use of AI from a social engineering perspective. Traditionally done by emails, a phishing campaign, and obviously we can, through generative AI solutions right now, we can very easily draft emails that can trick most people. And it's important actually to say, there is a scam and a trick for everybody. What's the art of persuasion? It's around showing authority. It's playing on people's fears, or their egos as well, to get them to click on or to follow different instructions. And now we can profile people, profile organizations extremely quickly, and build very convincing emails. Like going back to security awareness, what do we see in videos? How to spot a phishing email. Look for poor grammar, not well structured emails. All that's gone now, because you can put what you kind of want into as the gist and produce a perfect email, and in multiple languages. So now everybody is very much multilingual. And actually, I think, and just to bring some statistics to that, I think Varonis did a study last year, and 94% from their view of malware is delivered by phishing emails. And I'm going to forget exactly where this information come from. I think it was the Fish report. Saw that since the advent of ChatGPT, we've seen an over 4,000% increase in phishing attacks. And then we add in, so that's looking at grammar, but then let's add in actual deepfakes into that equation. Deepfakes are synthetic media that's quite often combining a few different AI techniques into one. So, there's one thing of doing voice manipulation. So if you're speaking to someone and it sounds like the person you expect it to be, then it's easy to be fooled. Even easier to fool people if they sound like that person and they look like that person. And that's what we've seen in a number of attacks. Either that combination of the two or one of them. And actually, to bring that to add some some realism to that, a couple of examples. Actually, I was down in South Africa last week at the IT Web Security Summit, actually doing a talk on deepfakes. But there was also my new favorite security researcher, Lisa Flynn, and she was doing a talk on some of her experiences with AI bots and using those in real time to target and trick organizations, and some of the insights and the snippets of the conversations were amazing because they were real-time conversations from an AI bot pretending to be the cyber insurance auditor, getting somebody in cybersecurity to give away all their information of how they deal with what platforms they have in place, how they deal with their sensitive information, particularly written information, what day do they put out their information to be shredded, and all done in the voice of Taylor Swift that no one cotted on to. So there's a great example. And we've seen examples with Ferrari where, messages start on WhatsApp. So not the traditional methods of communication. But what we see there is it starts off with a message and then, trying to get them into voice notes and then into an audio call, because then you can be really convincing. In Ferrari's case, I'm pretty sure it was the CFO targeted by someone impersonated the CEO. And when it's then how do we identify those? So it is trying to look for, it's going to get increasingly difficult to look for things that are slightly out of the ordinary. And in this instance, that occurred. And, the defense there was for the CFO to ask about a book recommendation from the week previous. And obviously they couldn't answer that question. We've actually seen an instance of that targeting our Nordics regional manager, that somebody impersonating our CEO, looking for bank transfers. Obviously that's the fraud that they want to carry out. He was able to identify it. I'm probably getting in trouble for this. Identify it because, in his opinion, the CEO was being too nice to him on text. So could identify it probably wasn't him. Besides some of the other things, so we always sort of kind of joke about that. And then you look at very well popularized or talked about in the media was Arup, the UK engineering firm, where one of their unfortunate employees in Hong Kong was tricked into giving away $25 million to 5 different accounts under the instruction of the CFO and others, and that was done through a video call. With, unfortunately, there's 4 people on it, but everyone except this guy was fake, and able to. Now these are pre-canned instructions that they're delivering, but if you go on to deepfake.vxf, you'll get all the information to use Deepfake Live, where you can impersonate someone in real time. So face swap in real time, and the point of that is to use for streaming media. So they're the real threats. So it's how do you suddenly start fighting against those, which is hugely challenging. And some of those, we're going to have to start looking, completely reassessing how we authenticate each other. And I've heard suggestions of having a physical code book that you can ask people, what's the word on page 25, paragraph 2, word 6. And you never know, we might get back to the Cold War era of spies sitting down next to each other. The cuckoo flies at midnight, yes, but only in August or whatever we might say, to be able to work out who's who.
Some very, very interesting examples and use cases, I must say. But then studies also say that almost a third of all the enterprises find it difficult or not good enough to use traditional identity verification methods. They seem to be ineffective with deepfake. So apart from the coding tricks that you were talking about, what's a code word and what's a password, what are they to do if they were to use technology or any other tools?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a few different aspects there. And I'm surprised at the stat, and I'd almost think, I'd challenge it to a certain extent. But I suppose it really depends upon exactly what area of authentication that we're talking about. And I think Entrust study had it at around 40% of people say that, or there's been a 40% or deepfakes account for 40% of all biometric fraud. Which is an amazing stat when you think, well, deepfakes haven't really been a convincing thing for that long. So, attackers have obviously cottoned on to how you can use it. And if we look what we can target with those, you could say, well, biometric authentication. If we talk about traditional authentication methods, obviously password and even MFA, you could say, well, very difficult for biometrics because they're not traditionally in there. But actually, we're using face facial recognition, all of us on our phones. And obviously deepfakes allow, one of those things that it checks is liveness. Is that a still picture or are they actually moving? Well, I'll tell you what, if you put held up an iPad to the camera, can it detect that actually this person moving around is a deepfake? Now, obviously, there's the ability to try and profile and work out, is it actually a 3D image that it's looking at? But one of the other challenges, and I appreciate you've asked me what to do, and I'm just throwing challenges out there, and it's not to try and scaremonger, but to really highlight the real challenge. That we're going to start to see that yes, a camera could try and tell, or the software can look at the data on the camera that's being streamed to it to say, well, actually, is that a real person? But what if you injected the camera into the system? And by injection, I mean a software camera registering itself as a device on that machine. Excuse me. And then actually just streaming fake data to that process that is trying to authenticate. So you can see how it could be easily abused to avoid and overcome some of those biometric challenges. But the other area where it comes into play is those sorts of know your customer, those KYC activities where you're signing up to the bank, or and actually very relevantly, we take a process of where we use a third party to screen everybody. Part of it's for their right to work, but also to ensure that they are who they say they are. And those, you think about that process, it's take a video of yourself through the application, read words so you can see that you're moving, and then you need to hold up your passport next to it so it can compare the people to understand you are who you say you are. Well, if you've got hold of someone's passport, then you can bypass that. And that's really where a lot of that deepfake fraud is going to come from. So there are technologies coming to market that can look for those to try and identify deepfakes. There was one, I'm going to forget the name of it now, but purported to have a 99% success rate. But actually that drops off extremely quickly. Deepfakes are becoming, it's a real arms race, but organizations are going to have to look at it comes back to the users, educating users. When we look at systems, then it's going to be a constant arm race, but we're going to need to invest in the right tools, particularly from a collaboration software perspective. Just going back to those retail breaches, it's claimed or reported that in co-op, the attackers had taken control of teams and were trying to engaging with employees to try and pull more information, and then eventually they spoke to the head of cyber, is what it's reported. Now, I don't think they were doing it through a deepfake, but you can see very easily in that instance, and they could deepfake in to be. Think about impersonating a CEO at that point, that if it can't be detected, then it's actually a legitimate communication tool. Very much easier than suddenly, if you think about it, to be able to trick somebody into paying 25 million into 5 different accounts.
And that's a scary thought. What is another scary thought is since AI is the base of effective deepfake, the fear of AI going rogue could well trigger the biggest cyber attacks in the history of digital existence. Are we ready for that?
Well, I suppose that's the Skynet scenario that we've got there, or actually war games. If anyone, the listeners that are old enough to go back to that far back, and I suppose that is a threat, particularly as we start to get more to very self-aware and actually it's not just about being self-aware. I mean, in the Skynet or Matrix actually is the other one where the machines suddenly realize they don't need us anymore, except for as a source of energy. When we kind of look at that, I think that's one thing that's probably quite out there, and I think we've got regulations that are getting in place to try and make sure that ethical use of AI, and they're not applied the same way absolutely everywhere. But when we look at use of genetic AI, I think it's less of deepfakes, although it can be used. I think it'd be quite a far stretch, but it'd probably be a great Hollywood movie about attackers using that to trick the people with that can press the buttons simultaneously to launch a nuclear strike. I think that is fiction rather than reality. And actually, just generally, the fear of AI and the threat that it faces, a lot of that is hype. In terms of this idea when AI suddenly became a real thing and talking point that commentators sort of talking about, well, actually, it's going to have all this self-aware malware that's going to redesign itself on the fly. I don't think that's reality. It's used to develop it a little bit quicker. But I think in reality, are we in a position where we can defend ourselves against rogue AI? No. Are we in a position when that's going to actually happen? No. And you've got to hope that we don't end up in that position, and that's going to really take from the ethical development and build out of AI.
Yeah, but that question stems from the idea that AI is constantly teaching itself. So we do not know when it's going to get there, and we are not prepared, like you said.
Yeah, so I think that all sits with the organizations that are creating these AI models. We've got to have implicit trust with them, that they are doing it the right way, which almost you could ask, how can we have that trust? And do we need to look at something ever so slightly different? That we're going to enforce and be able to audit that trust with them. And then also, how do we monitor the capability and what that AI is actually doing? Which again, as recipients of that AI and the use of it, it's kind of a little bit out of our hands. So as I say, there's definitely a trust piece.
So I think you just touched upon regulations a little while ago. Do you think there are any regulations, or are there any regulations or compliances in the pipeline that can control the use of AI for creating deepfakes, especially for malicious purposes, not for entertainment purposes?
Yeah. So what we don't want to do is stifle that creativity and all those memes that we love to see now. But I suppose there is regulation. I think it was August 2024. There was the EU AI Act started to come into play and is slowly being enforced. That really enforces organizations that develop AI to create it ethically, be transparent, so that protect users' data. So that's coming in. So there is regulation there. On the UK side, there is laws that I think are being debated. There's a lot of debate around AI laws. One of them is a huge crackdown. It was January in this year. The government announced they're going to crack down and make it illegal for anybody to create explicit images of people via deepfakes. But it's very, very centered on that kind of that use of it. But obviously, in general, anybody that's following UK news around AI use, there's a battle between the creatives and the government that wants to get to use it to turbocharge the economy and be a hotbed of AI development. But actually, there's also the flip side. What is it actually using and actually being used for? And in that instance, obviously, it's not a cybersecurity or security issue. It's around ripping off people's creative works. But you can see a similar approach there that will eventually apply to cybersecurity.
And I think in January this year, it was also for geopolitical reasons. There were elections happening all over, and there were a lot of deepfakes floating around. And I don't know whether I should speak about that, so I'll stop right now.
Well, my favorite little deepfake is of Trump and Musk dancing. And I always kind of start with that, and which you can kind of see that it's probably not them, partly because Donald Trump's waistcoat disappears halfway through his dance, but then flick to another video of them actually dancing to the YMCA at a New Year's party, and there's a significant difference between their dance moves.
And they're doing it again today, so one never knows.
Yeah.
So that's the end of my questions, and thank you so much for such interesting answers, Richard. My team here also enjoyed everything that you were talking about. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Oh, it was a pleasure as well. It's very rarely that we can discuss technology subjects with such a social view and everybody understands everything kind of a situation. Otherwise, it's tough.
Well, and just we're kind of wrapping up, but one of the comments that I had when talking to people last week was it's such an unknown or underestimated, not just in the general population, but in the cybersecurity world, and people got to open our eyes up to it.
Which is why I asked you the first question: are we ready for it?
Yeah.
We are not.
We are not.
Right. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered all bases there. Just to thank you again for having me on the podcast, and I look forward to my next appearance.
It was a pleasure, and we'll certainly plan something. And then when something more interesting comes up in the world of IT security and bigger threats, let's have a discussion. Or are we ready for that?
Yeah, look forward to it. All right,
thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. Please do follow us on social media for regular updates and new content.